The morning sun rose over Maplewood like a painter's brushstroke across a pale canvas. The small-town diner stood at the corner of Main Street, its windows glowing softly as light spilled over chrome edges and red leather booths. Inside, the air carried a familiar comfort, the scent of butter melting on hot griddles, the faint sweetness of syrup, the quiet clatter of dishes being set out for the morning rush. It should have been an ordinary day. For most of the patrons trickling in, it was. Truck drivers ordered steaming mugs of coffee, elderly couples split pancakes, and families coaxed sleepy children to eat before school. But for Clara this morning was different. Clara was 17, and unlike the others around her, she carried a heaviness the world could not see at first glance. She sat near the window in her wheelchair, a simple plate of pancakes before her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her fork, the nervousness in her movements betraying the calm face she tried to maintain. Clara had grown used to being stared at, whispered about, even pitied. Yet that did not make the weight of those moments easier to bear. Her life had been marked by a condition that confined her to the chair, a spinal deformity present since birth. Her parents had taught her to believe that her spirit was stronger than her legs, that she was capable of soaring in ways others could not. And Clara believed it, or at least she tried. But some mornings, when the world felt sharper than usual, she wondered if her parents' words were just hopeful lies meant to keep her from breaking. This morning carried that sharpness. At the next booth sat a group of teenage boys, their energy restless, their laughter loud enough to dominate the diner. They were the kind of boys who mistook cruelty for confidence, who built their own fragile strength by tearing others down. Their eyes found Clara almost immediately, as if drawn to her difference like moths to flame. At first it was just whispers. A mocking glance. A poorly disguised snicker. Clara had faced this many times before, and she tried to focus on her plate, on the sweetness of syrup, on the warmth of the diner. But then one boy leaned closer, his smirk crueler than the rest. Without warning, his hand lashed out, striking the edge of her plate. The pancakes tumbled, slow and surreal, before crashing onto the tiled floor. Syrup spread across the ground in sticky rivers. The laughter that followed pierced through Clara's chest like needles. Another boy shoved her wheelchair back with a mocking laugh, the sudden jolt sending her heart racing. The diner froze. Forks stopped midway to mouths, coffee cups hung in the air. Every sound seemed to collapse into silence, replaced by the sharp echo of teenage laughter. The humiliation burned hotter than pain, spreading across Clara's cheeks in a crimson flush. Her hands trembled. She wanted to shout, to fight back, to demand dignity. But her voice lodged in her throat, strangled by fear. The weight of every stare in the diner pressed down on her like stones. She bent forward, fumbling awkwardly to gather the ruined pancakes, desperate to make the scene disappear, desperate to keep her tears from spilling. The boys only laughed louder. To them, her struggle was entertainment. To them, her pain was a joke. Their arrogance filled the air, poisonous and heavy, as if mocking not only Clara but anyone who dared to care. And yet no one moved. The waitress, carrying a tray of steaming cups, froze in the aisle, her knuckles white against the porcelain. A father at the far booth lowered his gaze, shaking his head but saying nothing. A group of college students whispered among themselves but kept their eyes fixed on their plates. The diner was full, yet in that moment Clara had never felt more alone. Her chest tightened. Her throat burned. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the shadows of the diner and escape the humiliation. The laughter of the boys echoed in her ears, drowning out every other sound. It was in that silence, that suffocating moment of helplessness, that the morning took its first sharp turn. The laughter of the bullies echoed long after their cruel act, filling every corner of Maplewood Diner like a poison that seeped into the cracks of the tiled floor. Clara sat frozen, her small frame dwarfed by the wheelchair that seemed heavier than usual, heavier than her own trembling body could carry. The syrup from her pancakes pooled at her feet, sticky and shining under the sunlight streaming through the window. To anyone else it was just a spill. To Clara, it was the shattered symbol of her mourning, of her dignity. Her chest rose and fell unevenly as she bent forward, trying to gather the pieces of her ruined breakfast. The fork slipped from her trembling hands, clinking against the plate, the sound sharp enough to slice through the suffocating silence. She wanted to disappear into the floor, to fold herself into something small and invisible. Every time she tried to straighten the plate on her lap, it slipped again, her fingers too unsteady to control the tremors. Around her, the world remained still. Patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes flickering toward her before darting away, as if to look too long would bind them to responsibility. Some shook their heads in disapproval, but no one stood. No one raised a voice. Even the waitress, caught in the middle of the aisle, her tray of coffee cups steaming and wobbling slightly from her tense grip, looked too afraid to intervene. The boys continued laughing, their voices sharp, each chuckle a dagger twisting deeper. "Look at her," one sneered, his voice carrying across the diner. "Can't even pick up her own food." The others snorted, slapping each other's shoulders in triumph, as though humiliating Clara had made them kings of the room. Clara's throat burned with unshed tears, her eyes glistening as she struggled against the flood. She would not cry. She could not cry. Crying would give them victory, and she had already lost enough. Yet the more she resisted, the more her tears betrayed her, rising until her vision blurred. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped bird, frantic, desperate. Why does the world work like this? She thought. Why do people think cruelty is strength? Why does no one stop them? She wanted answers, but the silence around her was the only reply. Then, unexpectedly, another pair of hands entered her world. Not rough. Not mocking. Gentle. An older man, gray at the temples, bent down beside her. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but strong enough to be heard. "Don't mind them," he said, placing the plate carefully back on the table. His eyes, though kind, darted nervously toward the boys, as though he too feared the consequences of kindness. Clara looked at him, her lips parting to form words, but none came. The kindness felt like a fragile candle flickering in a storm. It warmed her for a moment, but the shadows around them were too heavy. The man's attempt was noble, yet it was a small gesture against the towering cruelty she had just endured. The bullies noticed his movement. One of them scoffed, his voice dripping with derision. "What's the matter, old man? Gonna fight for her?" His friends erupted in laughter again, the sound grating against the diner's walls. The man shrank slightly, his shoulders curling inward, and he retreated back to his booth. His courage had sparked, but it did not burn long enough to chase away the darkness. Clara stared down at her plate, appetite gone. Her fork lay untouched, and her throat felt too tight to swallow even if she had wanted to. She pressed her palms against her lap, grounding herself, willing her body not to shake anymore. But inside, her thoughts swirled chaotically, a storm she could not calm. She thought of her parents' words. "Your spirit was meant to soar even if your legs cannot." She clung to that belief like a lifeline, but this morning it slipped through her fingers like smoke. The world did not see her spirit. They only saw her chair, her trembling hands, her silence. The diner's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. The bullies had moved on to boasting about their so-called bravery, their laughter carrying, their voices loud as if daring anyone to challenge them. The other patrons kept quiet, their discomfort turning into avoidance. They sipped coffee, stared at menus fiddled with napkins, anything to keep from looking at Clara. Time slowed. Every tick of the clock above the counter stretched endlessly. Clara closed her eyes, breathing shallowly, praying for the hour to pass quickly, for the nightmare to end. She longed for the safety of her small room at home, where no one laughed at her, where no one shoved her wheelchair like it was a toy. Yet even in her despair, there was a tiny spark inside her. A stubborn ember that refused to die. She had survived too much to let this moment erase her completely. She had endured surgeries, endless stares, whispers that followed her down school hallways, nights of loneliness when even sleep seemed cruel. She had survived all of it. And though this morning cut deeper than most, she would survive this too. But she did not yet know that survival would not be enough. Not this time. Fate had something else in store, a force waiting just beyond the horizon of her despair. Outside, unnoticed by Clara, the sound of engines stirred faintly in the distance. At first it was nothing more than a hum, easily drowned out by the laughter of the boys. But with each passing moment, the hum grew louder, deeper, like thunder approaching across flat land. Inside the diner, Clara remained bowed over her plate, unaware that her prayer for change, whispered silently in her heart, was about to be answered in a way she never could have imagined. The hum that drifted faintly through the morning air outside Maplewood Diner soon grew into something undeniable. At first, it was a vibration felt in the floor tiles, so subtle that no one paid attention. Then, the vibration deepened, rattling the salt shakers on the counter and quivering the coffee in porcelain cups. Heads began to turn toward the wide glass windows at the front of the diner. The sound rolled in waves, heavy and relentless, like thunder chasing across the sky. It was unmistakable, the roar of motorcycles. Engines, dozens of them, each growling with a deep, metallic ferocity that made conversation falter and forks freeze midway to mouths. The bullies, mid-laugh, went silent for the first time since they had entered. Their smirks wavered, their laughter choking into nervous chuckles as they exchanged glances. Through the glass the sight became clear. One by one motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, chrome glinting under the sharp morning sun. Leather jackets caught the light, insignias bold against their backs. The diner filled with hushed murmurs, the atmosphere charged with both awe and unease. When the last motorcycle settled into place, the parking lot looked less like a simple row of vehicles and more like a wall of steel and power. Engines idled low, their rumble vibrating in the very bones of everyone inside. The insignia on the jackets needed no introduction. The Hell's Angels had arrived. Inside, tension coiled tighter with every second. The bullies shifted in their booth, their bravado shrinking under the weight of something they did not yet fully understand. Their arrogance had thrived in a room of silence, but this was different. Everyone knew the reputation of the Hell's Angels: fierce, fearless, unafraid of confrontation. The glass door swung open with a faint jingle of the bell. The sound was delicate, almost laughably small compared to the storm that entered behind it. The first man through was tall, broad-shouldered, his beard flecked with gray. His leather vest hung heavy with patches that told stories of battles fought and loyalties earned. His steel-hard eyes swept across the diner in one slow, deliberate motion. Behind him came another. And another. Boots thudded against the tiled floor as the group filled the entrance, each man carrying himself with a quiet intensity that needed no words. The air seemed to shrink around them, heavy with the weight of unspoken power. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her wide eyes reflected the sight of the men as they moved further inside. For the first time since the morning began, her heartbeat raced not from fear of cruelty but from a sudden, strange wonder. The bullies, however, paled visibly. Their laughter was gone, replaced by stiff shoulders and darting eyes. The leader's gaze moved over the diner like a blade, sharp and searching. When his eyes landed on the boys, they froze. It was as though he had already seen the truth, already pieced together what had unfolded in the diner before his arrival. Then his gaze shifted. It landed on Clara. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. He did not need anyone to explain. Her trembling hands, the plate still smeared with syrup, the silence of the patrons who dared not intervene, it told him everything. His eyes softened, though his jaw remained set like stone. He stepped forward, boots heavy on the floor, the sound echoing louder than the boys' laughter ever had. The diner held its breath. Clara's pulse raced, her body torn between fear and an unfamiliar sense of protection. The leader stopped at her side. He bent down on one knee so he would not tower over her. His presence was commanding, yet the gesture was gentle. For the first time that morning, Clara did not feel small. She felt seen. Behind her, the bullies squirmed in their seats, faces pale, their arrogance crumbling under the weight of the silence. They had mocked her when she was alone. They had laughed when the diner stood still. But now, with a wall of leather and steel behind her, they could not muster even a word. The leader, his name murmured by someone in the diner, was Roar, turned his head slowly toward the boys. His voice, when it came, was low and steady but powerful enough to cut through the thick air. Though Clara could not hear every word, she saw the effect it had. The bullies' faces drained of color, their shoulders collapsing inward, their bravado dissolving into shame. "Stand up," Roar said at last. They obeyed. One by one the boys slid out of the booth, no longer bold, no longer laughing. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor, their hands shoved awkwardly into their pockets. Not one dared look at Clara. Not one dared meet Roar's gaze. The diner remained utterly silent as they stumbled toward the door, shoving each other in their rush to escape. When they stepped outside, they were met with the wall of motorcycles, engines still idling like growling beasts. The riders who had stayed outside stared them down with cold, unblinking eyes. The boys' humiliation was complete. Inside, Clara sat rigid, her hands clasped together, unsure if she should speak, unsure if she could even find the words. All she knew was that the nightmare had shifted. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her fear lift, replaced by something stronger, something she could not yet name. Roar turned back toward her. His expression softened, his voice lowering to something only she could hear. Though the words were quiet, the meaning wrapped around her like a shield. "You're stronger than they'll ever be." The diner remained still even after the boys had fled, leaving behind only the echo of their fading footsteps and the sour memory of their cruelty. For a moment no one spoke. The rumble of engines outside filled the silence, steady and unyielding, like a heartbeat that belonged not to one man but to an entire brotherhood. Clara sat motionless, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. The morning had begun with humiliation, Yet now she found herself surrounded by the kind of strength she had never imagined would stand for her. The towering man named Roar straightened from his kneeling position, his presence as heavy as the leather vest stretched across his broad chest. He turned his head and gestured to the waitress. She hesitated at first, her tray trembling in her hands, but the command in his eyes was not harsh, it was reassuring. She set down her tray and hurried over, still pale from the tension of the morning. "Bring her whatever she wants," Roar said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill and placed it on Clara's table. It was not just enough for pancakes, it was enough for everything on the menu twice over. Pancakes, milkshake, pie, the whole table if she asks for it. The waitress's eyes widened. She nodded quickly, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something more, but instead she turned and rushed back toward the counter, relief flooding her expression as she finally had a reason to act. Clara looked at the bill, then up at Roar. Her voice cracked. She stopped, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. For so long she had carried her struggles quietly, accepting the stares and whispers as an unchangeable part of life. But now, with these men standing beside her, she felt words fighting to surface. Roar leaned down slightly, his face softer now, his eyes no longer steel but something warmer. "You're stronger than any of those cowards," he said, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret meant only for her. "Don't ever forget that." Clara's chest tightened, not from fear this time but from something she hadn't felt in years: recognition. For once she was not invisible. She was not a victim to be pitied. She was someone worthy of respect. The other bikers stood in silence, their imposing frames filling the room like a shield. Patrons who had earlier lowered their heads now lifted their gazes, guilt etched on their faces. A few clapped softly, hesitant at first, then louder, until the diner hummed with a quiet but steady applause. Some wiped at their eyes. The college students whispered among themselves, this time not with avoidance but with awe. Roar studied Clara for another moment. Then, slowly he reached for his own vest. The leather was worn, the patches sewn into it weathered by years of wind, rain, and road. It was not just clothing, it was a symbol of loyalty, of family, of belonging. He removed it carefully, as though the weight of its meaning demanded reverence. Clara's eyes widened. "No, I can't." But he draped it over her shoulders anyway. The vest hung heavy against her small frame, but it did not swallow her. It lifted her. For the first time, she felt armored, as if the leather itself carried protection and dignity she had never known. "Your family now," Roar said. The words broke her. Not in the way the bullies had broken her spirit earlier, but in the way a flood breaks through a dam that has held too long. Tears streamed freely down her face, unstoppable, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of finally being seen. The waitress returned with a fresh plate of pancakes, a tall milkshake topped with whipped cream, and a slice of warm apple pie. She set them gently before Clara, her own eyes glistening. "You'll never sit here alone again," she whispered, giving Clara's hand a squeeze before stepping back. Clara looked at the food, at the vest across her shoulders, at the faces around her. Where once she had seen indifference, now she saw respect. Where once she had felt small, now she felt strength pressing in from every side. The bikers stayed long enough to ensure the bullies did not return, their silent presence a wall of assurance. Patrons resumed eating, though the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were hushed but reverent, each person knowing they had witnessed something they would never forget. Clara took a bite of the pancakes. The syrup was sweet, but it tasted different now. It tasted like victory, like dignity reclaimed. She sipped her milkshake, the coldness soothing her raw throat, washing away the bitter taste of humiliation that had lingered since the boy's cruelty. Her heart, still fragile, began to feel something she had not dared to hope for, hope itself. She realized cruelty would always exist, but so would courage. Sometimes it came from the least expected places, from people whose faces were rough, whose appearances spoke of danger, but whose hearts carried a fierceness that protected rather than harmed. When the bikers finally left, the roar of their engines filled the parking lot once more. Clara watched them through the diner's window, her hand pressed lightly against the leather vest. They rode away in a line, the morning sun glinting off their chrome, leaving behind not fear but a silence charged with inspiration. The patrons clapped again as they disappeared down the street, and Clara found herself smiling through her tears. It was not the smile of someone who had been rescued, but of someone who had discovered strength in herself because others had reminded her it existed. That night, as she sat in her room, the vest draped across her bed, Clara replayed every moment. The bully's cruelty still stung, but it no longer defined the day. What defined it was the way strangers had stood up, the way kindness had arrived like thunder, unexpected and unstoppable. She whispered softly into the quiet, "I am not invisible. I am not broken. I am family." And for the first time in a very long time she believed it.